Welcome to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, where you'll hear highly accomplished and fascinating guests talk about the challenges they've overcome and the winning mindsets that have led them to great success. And now your host, Dr. Bob.
Hello, welcome to another episode in Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. My guest today is Dumisani Washington, a man with multiple interests, talents, and accomplishments. He's a musician, a graduate of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music with a major in piano. He's also an author, having recently published Zionism the Black Church, Why Standing with Israel Will Be a Defining Issue for Christians of Color in the 21st Century. It's available on Amazon. And he is a pastor. He is the bishop of the Congregation of Zion Church in Stockton, California, a church that he founded in 2006. He is also a Christian Zionist, meaning that he believes that the Jews are God's chosen people and that the land of Israel belongs to them. Much of his current work centers around the importance of Israel and the Jewish people and their connection with Black people in America and around the world. In our discussion with him today, we will delve more deeply into his pro-Israel activities in the Black community. Dumisani, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. It's great to be here with you.
I'm amazed that you've accomplished so much, especially considering that you and Valerie, your wife of 33 years, have 6 talented children to take care of. I hope today that you'll give us valuable insights into the blessings that you have received that enabled you to have such a full and productive life. Let's start at the beginning. You were born Dennis Ray Washington in 1967 in Little Rock, Arkansas, the segregated South. You were the youngest of 7 children. Tell us about your parents, David and Lillian, and the influence that they had in your life.
My parents were amazing people of blessed memory, as my Jewish friends would say. My mom passed away in 2002, my dad in 2012. But they raised all 7 of us. Dr. Bob, again, born in Little Rock, but then grew up in California because we moved. I was not quite 1 year old, the earlier part of 1968. My dad was a son of a sharecropper in the rural parts of North Little Rock, Arkansas. So he grew up slopping pigs, doing the whole thing, right? The hardest back-breaking work, as he would say, probably that exists. Mm-hmm. And he was the oldest of the 2 sons. He had 4 sisters, I believe, and another brother. But he didn't graduate from high school in large part because he had to actually do the harvest a couple times by himself because his dad had taken sick, and so had his brother. My mom grew up in North Little Rock, Arkansas, in the city. And she was the youngest of her family, very, very proud of her community. They talked a lot to me. I didn't grow up in Arkansas, but I felt like I did because we talked so much about the community, Dr. Bob. One of the key things for my mom, that though it was the segregated South, she didn't talk to me a whole lot about what the racism was, Dr. Bob. She talked about the pride of her community, the high school she graduated from, the pastors, the leaders of the community, and she was very fond of it. As I got older, I realized that as we were in California, part of her missed what she had there in Arkansas, that wholly integrated, that Black community that existed, like our Jewish friends, because of discrimination, they built their institutions. Absolutely, right. Dr. Bob. So they were amazing people. So we learned a lot from them.
And your life is filled with a passion for the Bible. When did that interest start?
That started as early as I can remember, right? So my parents are both faithful members of King Solomon Baptist Church in North Little Rock, Arkansas. I was born at the church, maybe not literally in the building, but all of my siblings were there, and that's when I guess my mom discovered my passion for music as an infant, right? I would sit there on her knee. My dad was on the deacon board. He sang in the choir. My mom served on the matron board at the youth ministry. They were very, very involved, right? So I'm a little kid, and I'm a baby, literally. I'm sitting on my mom's knee in church, and the music is going, right? And according to my mom and dad, I'm rocking the music and the baby, and every Sunday when the pastor would get up to preach, I would look him right in the face and I would start to cry. And I gave him a complex, apparently, to my parents. And my mom said, I guess you just love the music so much that when the music stopped, you wanted to hear the music and everything. And so that's how I actually came up in church in that way. And our parents also bought us Bibles, right? So they were very devout, very, very staunch Christians. And not a staunch in a bad sense. They love God. They love to worship. They love going to church. And so, like all of us, I would read. But Dr. Bob, that passion started then, unbeknownst to me, right? I would read in grade school, read my scriptures, and I was always drawn to the Old Testament, to our Jewish friends, to the Tanakh. And I read the New Testament. I love the stories of Jesus and the miracles and everything, but I found myself more with the patriarchs. I know about Moses and about David and everything, and I didn't know what that was about. It makes more sense now, right? But at the time, I didn't know. I didn't know what that was. And by the time I'm maybe 6th, 7th grade, I've read these stories myself over and over and over again, right? And
not because your parents forced you to.
Even when they bought us the Bibles, they didn't say, no, you go read this, you go, they we went to church, everything like that, but they bought our Bibles so that we could have, the kids' versions, little pictures and that type of thing. But I was drawn to it, Dr. Bob. I was drawn to Israel. I was drawn to the God of Israel. I was drawn to the Red Sea and the whole Passover narrative, even though I'm understanding as much as I can as a grade schooler, right? But there was something that was just lit a fire in me. I wanted to know about Jacob and his brothers and, and then his sons and all those types of things. It was always something that was so fascinating to me. And that's when it started, Dr. Bob. There was this, in the Black church tradition, generally speaking, there's always what I call a strong spiritual Zionism, right? This identification.
I didn't know that.
The Negro spirituals, the people who are filled with music, are familiar with the music styles in America. It was always based on the scriptures, but mostly on the Old Testament. Go Down Moses.
Yes.
Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Elijah Rock. See, these songs were based on Israel, the God of Israel, and they were sung on slave plantations believing for freedom, right?
Yes,
so Harriet Tubman was called Moses, right? So
I see, just like Moses led the Jews out of Egypt,
yes, sir.
You were hoping that someone would lead the blacks out of slavery.
Absolutely, yes, sir.
I get it.
I talk about in my book, there's a whole section that talk about just the Negro spirituals themselves and what the messages were that were in them, right? The songs of hope, songs of deliverance, and we were crying out to the God of Israel for deliverance, right? This is why this connection was always there, right? And so I haven't talked about in the book about even from Africa itself, knowing, of course, all these things, Sinai, Africa, all these things are happening there. So there's this fame of Moses, there's this fame. Zora Neale Hurston is one of the most famous, what we call Harlem Renaissance authors, right? One of the Black authors. And she talked about it, about this whole fame of Moses throughout Africa and different parts of the world, that what God did through Moses for the children of Israel became this fame that was spread around all over the world, right? He represented deliverance, represented freedom, right? And it's funny now to this day, some in the Jewish homes, when they have the Passover Seder, they may sing Go Down Moses, right? Let my people go, right? There's these interconnected things. So for me, I'm not understanding it maybe on that deeper historical level, but I knew for me as a young person reading the scriptures, there was something going on inside of me as I'm reading it. They weren't just stories to me. I'm reading something that happened, and I would as I'm reading it, I'm watching, I'm there. Feeling it there. Nice. It's funny, my Jewish friends said, Dumisani, you were at Sinai, that type of thing. I said, well, whether in the sense of, from Israel, I said, for all I know is that emotionally there was a connection at a very, very young age when I would read it.
And still you accepted, of course, your blackness.
Yes, sir.
And that was shown by you changing your name from Dennis to Dumisani.
Yes, sir.
Why did you do that?
So, Dr. Bob, that was around around 1990, so I'm in my early mid-20s. And part of it's funny, what was going on at that time in my life was the Israel thing, and I call it an Israel thing and an Africa thing all at the same time. So you had, among other things, this desire. As again, I'm a young kid, I'm reading the scriptures, always know about Israel. But in my early 20s, I want to know, I've become fascinated with Africa, right? Sure. And again, this wasn't from my home either. My parents, we didn't talk about Africa. There wasn't this thing. There was just something that began to happen. It's funny, you stuff makes sense when you look back on your life. At the time when it's going on, it may not make any sense, right? So I'm studying about Africa, and at this point, we're homeschooling our children. We're married, my wife and I, a few kids. Not all 6 yet.
Wise decision.
One of the best ones in my life, other than marrying my wife, was us homeschooling our kids, Dr. Bob.
Wow.
And so I wanted to teach. So I'm studying about Africa, the geopolitics, the history, the type of thing. And so at some point, the kids, they know all 52 at that time African states and their capitals and all these types of things. I'm wanting to know. I'm delving. I'm reading different books and everything. And at this time, Dr. Bob, I'm also wanting to know more about the Jewish roots of my faith as a Christian, right? So I'm reading books. The internet's not really a thing yet, right? You know what I'm saying?
Of course
so
not.
Going to the library, all that kind of stuff. And I'm finding out things about the Jewishness of Jesus. The scriptures. So before, when I'm young, I would just read these scriptures in the Old Testament, and there wasn't this connection that was there, right? Because there was
no Jesus.
Right,
in the Old
right. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So you're not seeing that this whole where's this Moses thing come in? So as Christians, we're like going, oh, okay, understanding that. Okay, so then there's this thread that's there in our faith, and that what's going on with Jesus and his disciples. There's a lot of quoting from the Old Testament, right? But it's not always highlighted, right? So I'm getting to do that, want to know that. Jesus does a Passover Seder. Jesus does, and so I'm wanting to know more of these things. So all these things kind of converge. So one of my good friends at the time, her name is Noma Timba. She's from South Africa, and almost like an auntie in our family. And I said, Noma Timba, I think I want to change my name. I feel this journey, right? There's this journey that was happening that was kind of redefining me. It wasn't based on anger and frustration, but Dr. Bob, there was this searching, seeking and everything. And so she's of the Zulu tribe. And then she helped me. She said, Dumisani. Dumisani is a Zulu word which means praise. She said, you do so much music. I said, this was on my heart. Dumisani. It comes from the Zulu phrase, Dumisani u Yehovah, which is the Hebrew phrase, hallelujah. Dumisani u Yehovah, praise the Lord. So she said, your name's Dumisani. And I said, yeah. And so we had a naming ceremony and everything. So years ago, that's how it changed to Dumisani. Yes, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful story. And that carried through, and soon after that, when you finished, you became the diversity outreach coordinator for CUFI, which is the largest pro-Israel organization in America, Christians United for Israel. How did you get involved with CUFI? You were a musician at the time, right? Making a living, probably not a great living, but making a living.
Yes, sir. Right? Musician at the time, pastoring at the time, and also while in Stockton, California, we also had a music school, the Zion Academy of Music. There's part of it, and they had different instruments and students and everything like that.
And that was part of the church?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Well, what's funny is that it preceded the church. We started Zion Academy when my kids were really young, 1996. And the church isn't born until like about 8 years later. Maybe, 2004, actually, 8 years later. So you have the music schools operating in the city. The students are coming from different parts.
And this was your school?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Fantastic. You started the school.
We started the school, right. Dr. Bob. It was funny, out of the homeschool thing. We were teaching our kids music, and we said, hey, maybe there's some other kids want to, we start to open it up, and next thing you know, kids are coming in. We had a great time, and we did it for years. My son grows up. He goes to get his music degree from UOP there in Stockton, and then he begins to recruit other instructors, and now we have whole departments. We have a theater department in the thing. We have the band. We have the jazz band. It becomes this whole thing, in large part because of the way my son began to recruit all these different teachers and everything. So,
and it is still in existence now?
No, it's no longer now. So it ran for 21 years.
Wow.
When we moved to 21 years, Dr. Bob, the whole time. We had an amazing time. At some point, we may reestablish it. Yeah. We ended it shortly before we moved. Of course, as you know, we live in North Carolina now. And so we were still, the musicians who are at the church now, they still do teaching and coaching and other students and everything, but the school itself.
But that's a hell of a nice run for a music school.
Dr. Bob, we had a great time. We will never forget it. It was just an amazing thing. And the music was so, like you're saying, go back to I know you're from CUFI, all these things are intertwined, right? All these different layers that are there, right? And so I know about CUFI because my friend, Victor Stursky, who was at that time the Eastern Region Coordinator for CUFI.
I know Victor.
Yeah, you know Victor. We were he's in Sacramento, I'm in Stockton. A mutual friend introduces us, right? You guys need to meet each other.
So he has a band.
He has a band,
right.
Absolutely. He told me about his band, and we started to do music together. And so CUFI would do, as you know, what's called a Night to Honor Israel. So Victor said, hey, I have my band. Would you come and play with us? We're going to go. We did the Night to Honor Israel in Reno. We went in Rochester. He said, would you do that? I said, sure, no problem. And Dr. Bob, it was in those events with CUFI that I began to learn even more about the modern state of Israel. Now, back up a little bit. My first introduction to the modern state of Israel was when I was in high school at the Ethiopian Aliyah, the Operation Moses.
I remember that, of course.
Dr. Bob, it was November 1984. I had to go back and check. This was my senior year of high school. I graduate that next spring. I'm literally on my way out the door some evening to go play basketball or whatever with my friends, right? And somehow my wife's watching, my mom is watching ABC News, Peter Jennings. I remember who that broadcaster was, right? And he did a little segment, boom. on the Aliyah. But he's saying that back in the day when there was just the network television and news
the
thing.
news used to be about world news.
Yes, right, absolutely.
Right? It was real news.
And it was the very last part of his segment. He said, and finally tonight, and I still remember some of what he's saying.
Wow.
And he's talking about what had happened. Of course, it was a secret that became open, right? Because the IDF, they're secretly airlifting the Jews from the Sudanese border.
Black Jews.
Yes, absolutely. Black Jews from Ethiopia, right? Yep. So I had never even heard of such a thing before, right? So it caught me, Dr. Bob. I'm 17 years old, I think, yeah? And so I'm on my way out, and something grabbed my attention, almost like God just kind of took my face and went to the television. I'm on my way at the door. I looked at the television, and I saw 2 pictures. One was Ethiopian Jews at Ben Gurion Airport on the ground, kissing the ground.
Yes.
And another one was a mom. She had the baby in her back. They'll do the rap, And another one, she's standing next to her, they're just dancing. Because they're dancing for joy, right? I have no idea what I'm looking at, right? Because I don't know about the modern state of Israel. I don't know about the Ethiopian Jews. None of those things,
You knew the Bible, but you didn't know anything about Israel.
Didn't know anything about Israel today, right? And it caught my attention, Dr. Bob, and I didn't know why, right? I knew later on, and I saw that it was like etched in my brain. So I went outside and I played and everything. And then years later, that begins to come back. And I go, oh, okay. And I start to research the Jews, the diaspora, the Jews from here, the Jews from there. It's just like someone turns on a switch. Boom, I want to know. I don't know. So this love for Israel that was the Bible kind of began this whole modern state of Israel. So now I'm with CUFI and I'm at these nights to honor Israel. And people are speaking. They may be from Israel. They may be others from the Jewish community and everything.
I was invited. Somehow I heard about it in San Diego.
Yeah.
And it was inspiring.
Yes, sir. Yes,
to
sir.
see all of these non-Jews
Yes, sir.
attending and singing in praise of Israel
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
in Hebrew. Many of the songs in Hebrew.
Yes,
a
sir.
great band,
Yes,
a
sir.
very uplifting
sir.
spiritual experience
Yes, sir.
that, frankly, I don't get when I go to temple, Jewish temple. I don't get that uplifting experience.
Yes, sir.
And they're waving Israel flags. I cried.
Yes, sir.
And after that, I adopted CUFI as one of my prime charities, and I'm on very good terms with Pastor Hagee and his wonderful wife and their family.
Yes,
so I can see what that happened to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You were at that night on Israel, knowing very little about it.
Yeah, didn't know much about it at all. And I'm on the music, I'm on the stand with the band, everything, and I'm watching and I'm learning and I'm seeing. And this love for Israel, this love for the Jewish people, this love in the scriptures begins to culminate. And so I take my first trip to Israel as a guest pastor, part of the African American Pastors Tour with CUFI.
Which CUFI runs.
Yes, absolutely. To December 2012. It just happened to be Hanukkah, 2012. At the time, Dr. Michael Stevens was the African American Outreach Coordinator, and that's when I first met him. He's actually based in Charlotte, and just ironically. And I had never met him before. I knew David Brogg, who was the executive director at the time. He gave me an extended invitation to go. I'd always wanted to go, obviously, this love for Israel, so I went. And Dr. Bob, as many people have testified themselves, it was a huge shift for me. Going to the Western Wall. I was so I talk about this in my book, that I was so overcome with emotion, I couldn't even go up to the wall the first day, right? I was in the back. Right, but I was so emotional I couldn't get to the wall. I just wasn't expecting that experience. I wasn't really going with a preconceived. I wanted to go. I always wanted to go to the land, but I didn't really have an idea. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. But the power of Jerusalem, and then the power of that place. I didn't. It's funny. It's only later on when I walked by and I saw one of those placards that says the divine presence never leaves this place. I could attest to that because I having never read that.
You felt it.
Dr. Bobby was so powerful. But later on, the next day, we were in Jerusalem several days, and I'm an early morning person, so I got up. Dr. Bob got me a cab from our hotel, went to the Western Wall like at 5 in the morning and everything. And there's a few people, obviously not very many. And I had one of the most tremendous spiritual experiences I've ever had in my life. And it was during that time that I really felt a commission from God, that this love, this passion I have for Israel, this passion I have for Africa, they kind of were married at that moment.
Perfect.
And I said, okay, now lights are going on, right? And God's just talking to me. When you go back to the States, I want you to strengthen the alliance between Israel and Africa. I want you to strengthen the alliance between the Black and Jewish community. Of course, as I tell the congregation jokingly, you know if God's put something on your heart because you have no idea how you're going to do it, right? It's like going, right, okay, I don't know how that's going to happen, but I could feel it so strongly. And when I got back, I started the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, began to talk, college campuses, churches, the synagogues. God just began to open up doors. I did that for a year, and then David Brogg invited me to come on staff with CUFI. So the IBSI...
A bigger organization
Yes,
that
sir.
offered you some mass.
Absolutely,
Right,
yes, sir.
right.
Went there, and I served on CUFI staff almost 7 years.
And what was your role there? What was the objective? What did they tell you?
So what was happening was, what was funny was that the conversation that David Brogg and I had at the time was that there was a need for, obviously, advocacy in terms of the Black American community. But I told David part of what my desire was in that role, that we begin to establish what we call the diversity outreach, right? So that there would be that type of outreach in the Hispanic community, Asian community, Native American,
Because
right?
CUFI until that point was mainly white people.
Yes.
White Americans.
You had a Hispanic outreach coordinator. I can't remember the name at the time, and you had Dr. Stevens, who was the African American outreach coordinator, and you had those things in place. So CUFI is growing, is doing amazing things, and because of the nature of the Christian church, because there's a scripture in the book of Revelation that says John said that he saw a number, and he saw every nation, tribe, kindred, and tongue. And what's true about our co-religionists, they're Black, they're white, they're Hispanic, they're Asian, right? So you have many of them who love Israel, right? They have this biblical love for and everything. And so that was one of the things we said, is that we want to be able to intentionally reach these other people as much as we possibly can. Dr. Bob, unlike the identity politics thing, when it becomes a negative thing where I'm only trying to manipulate people and trying to get them to do whatever. We're saying
and you're trying to separate people.
Exactly, right? You're trying for the purpose of division, for the purpose of power, right?
Right.
We're saying the church is already, the Christian church has all these ethnic groups that are there. Let's try to make sure we're reaching everybody. So when I come on staff, we're intentionally doing bilingual events in Mandarin.
Fantastic.
We're doing, obviously, the Hispanic outreach as well, and trying to bolster that even some more. Native American pastors, and we're trying to, how are we reaching intentionally? And that was the goal. And I have to say this, not because you're the one interviewing me. One of the things we're most grateful for was, along with that, we wanted to reach the multi-ethnic body of Christ, as we'd always say, but we'd also want to strengthen that messaging in terms of Israel. And so that's where the Mizrahi Project came in. Because of your generosity, we were able to make that happen, where we told the story of the over 850,000 Jews expelled from North Africa and the Middle East, story people do not know, right?
And I'd like you to talk more about that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And of course, they're going to be able to learn more, and I'll tell them how to do that. But most people, when you say the word refugees, immediately it's Palestinian. It's the first thing. That's all you hear about at the UN, Palestinian refugees.
Right.
You never hear about other refugees, and there are many different refugees around the world.
Right.
But the earliest refugees were Jews.
Yes.
So tell us about that. Where they came from, how they were treated.
Throughout North Africa and the Middle East, Jewish communities that predate Christianity, that predate Islam, right? Thousands of years, right? So that you're talking about Jewish people from the time of the destruction of the first temple, 586 BC, and what's modern day Iraq, Iran, Persia, right? Scattered throughout. But then Algeria, Egypt, these areas, all throughout Turkey, as you know, Dr. Bob, almost 1 million in the number. The reason why they say that, that's the number that we get from those who were expelled or forced to flee those homes that they had been in for literally thousands of years. Libyan Jews who had been there for over 2,000 years, the whole thing. Even for Christians, I always challenge them. I said, when we read about Jesus, when his life is in danger, Joseph takes his family down into Egypt, right? It's because there's a Jewish community there in Egypt. And so, Dr. Bob, it was only that my friends in the Bay Area, and shout out to my good friend Rachel Waba, who's part of the Jemena, Jews Indigenous to Middle East and North Africa. It's based there in the Bay Area there. I met Rachel through some other social media things, and she's the one who first told me about that, right? There's love for Israel, right? There's love for the Jewish people, but I had never heard these stories, these layers of stories. Yes. Right. She tells me about it. I read the book. She gives me the book, In Ishmael's House by Sir Martin Gilbert. Amazing. He explains it. I know there's more other books that are on there, but it was such a comprehensive one for me. And that story of the Jews from Algeria, from Egypt, from Libya, from Syria, these Jewish communities. And we felt a need to tell the story, right? I met Rachel before being on staff with CUFI, but once I was on staff with CUFI, one of the things that we wanted to do was the project, and they're gracious enough to say, okay. And then it was Dr. Bob who funded it, and because of that, Dr. Bob, and we were able to. It was a humbling thing, Dr. Bob, on many levels. We wanted to get firsthand testimony from the Jews, whether they're first or second generation
Whatever
Jews
generation,
who
yeah.
left, right?
Were
And
forced to leave.
Forced to leave.
Right,
Forced to leave. Flee. Rachel's family experienced the Farhud there. But people don't know. 1941, what's that? Several years before the state of Israel was reborn, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who's working hand in hand with Adolf Hitler, right? These stories that people don't know, right? So they set up their whole garrison. He's all excited. So he's setting up, he's killing Jews in Libya, the Farhud, he sets that off, that whole thing. So the people aren't aware of that, right? They're thinking that it happened, and as much it happened in Poland and it happened in Germany, I tell people, Hitler recognized the Jews were a diaspora. So he had a worldwide mindset that he was going to try to destroy the Jews anywhere they were, but people don't know that, right? And so we wanted to tell the story, and what's called the Mizrahi Project. They're about 2-3 minute short films in which these people are telling their own stories.
Now, I went online and tried to find the source or videos, and I couldn't find it.
It's only the website I saw wasn't up, but it's on YouTube. So people have to go to YouTube. The YouTube page is still up, and all the videos are there.
It'll be under the Mizrahi Project.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely. They go on there. They can find all the videos sitting there.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. And I'll tell this one. There's many stories and many connections that we had, but there was one out just real quick. The Iranian. So there's the Persian Jewish community, right? As you know, in LA, there's a very large Persian Jewish community.
I was going to mention that. I didn't know you knew that.
Yeah, I did. Well, only from this work. Carmel Malamed, he is a Persian Jewish journalist who's based there in LA, and we met during the Mizrahi Project while I was getting the stuff together, and he was helping us get interviewees. What we were doing, we would reach out to the Jewish community in different parts of the country. And we would say, "Would you? Work. Yeah, can we do this? Can we?" And Dr. Bob, it was amazing. That I almost told a different story, but I'll tell this one. So what happened was in L.A., Carmel had contacted several different people, along with Jemena. They said they got us people who would be willing to come and tell their story, right? And there's one young lady. I talk about her in the book. I gave her a pseudonym, and she said, "Pastor Dumisani, I want to thank you so much for what you all are doing. Thank you for what CUFI is doing, and because it's the only Christian effort to tell the story, right? The only other ones, they're Jewish, but they're usually not outside of the Jewish community, right?" And she said, "But I have to decline to be in the project." And she sent this by email, and she let us know she still has family in Iran. And she said, "I have no doubt that once the video is out and it's seen, my family will suffer." Dr. Bob, I write about it in my book, it hit us like a ton of bricks. We felt we were doing holy work. We knew this was something that we felt we had to do, but it brought it home to us. And I even said this in the book. I said, she can't do this. It wasn't just past stories, right? This happened, right?
Right then.
Right now, because of the Ayatollah regime in Iran, this lady could not, who advocates, she does all this work in the LA area, but she has to do it in a certain way, right? Because she knows that her family would be harmed or killed. Or you know what I mean?
think there are only about 30 Jews left in Iran. That's what I understand. Down from 200,000 20 years ago.
It was quite amazing, Dr. Bob, at that moment in the Mizrahi Project, which was already near and dear to our hearts. So you talked about going to a night to honor Israel, and as a Jewish man going and seeing the love for Israel, love for Jewish people. Dr. Bob, and having experienced that and watched that, it's just an amazing thing for us to see, to watch and see. This Mizrahi Project, very, very similar. We had people, Jewish refugees from Syria, from Iraq, another quick story again. Once the Mizrahi Project, the films were out, we did like a compilation, and we would begin to do events in different parts of the country, both within the Jewish community, but also to introduce us to the non-Jewish community. We want you to know this part of Israel's story. Like you said, do you know about the Palestinian refugees? Do you know about this? Do you know what actually happened? This is the whole story, get the whole story. And we were at a place, we were in Chicago. Peggy Shapiro is one of my good friends, would stand with us. And we did a screening, some of the films that were there. And Peggy Shapiro, whose mom passed away a couple of years ago, her mom was a Holocaust survivor. So I'm sitting right next to Peggy's mom, right? And she's watching, and she's mesmerized. She's watching the stories, Libya and, Egypt, and she's listening to the stories. And she's talking, because the stories are of hope, right? They're not just of dispossession, but how they move forward, right? Once again, we lost everything, we rebuilt, right? We moved to Israel, or we moved to the States, whatever, like that. We rebuilt our Jewishness, our families, everything. So you're seeing this whole people who have thousands of years of dispossession, but have continued to move and be resilient, which is that whole, the Black Zionist thing, that whole being inspired by what God did, right? So we're watching this, and when it was over, Peggy's mom turns to me and she says, they were a world away. I guess she was from Austria, maybe. She said, they were a world away, meaning Libya and everything. She said, but they were saying the same things we were saying. They were praying the same prayer. Here she is as this Jewish woman who experienced the Holocaust, right? Survived. And she was learning this part of her family in North Africa and the Middle East. And it was a chilling moment for me. She said, I'm listening to them tell their stories, and it's what we went through. But she wasn't aware of them, but she's listening to them tell the same story. Dr. Bob said that it is another thing that drove it home for me. It's like, oh my God. So that's what was so amazing to us about just being a part of the project and everything. So yeah.
Well, thank you for the efforts and the results of the Mizrahi Project. Now, you're a Zionist and you believe that Jews are God's chosen people. I'm not sure what he chose us for. This is another issue, right, that I always ask. But you certainly believe the land of Israel belongs to them. As it's recorded in the Old Testament. But these days, there are many people, especially on the left, who passionately argue that the land belongs to the Palestinians and that Israel is a colonialist country and that Jews have no place there. So how do you respond to that?
Well, they're wrong. And especially the political nature of that whole disinformation thing, Dr. Bob. I talk about that in my book as well, how when you have this unholy alliance of the KGB and the Palestinian narrative coming together, Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, recruited by the KGB. I talk about this in my book. We have all the information. As the young people say, we have all the receipts. We know about how he was trained, Palestine Liberation Organization, a creation of the KGB, for that very reason, to dispossess the Jewish people. You had the Soviet Union helping finance the wars against Israel, working with the Arab states and everything.
Yeah, because the Soviet Union, it may not have hated the Jews, but what it did was feared the United States and wanted their influence in the Middle East to control oil. And the best way to do that would be to destabilize Israel to start with.
Absolutely right, Dr. Bob. Yeah. You know exactly what happened. And Stalin starts this whole anti-Zionist thing, like you said, not so much anti-Jewish in his mind. His thing was, let me destroy the United States. Let me stir up the Jew hatred in the Western world. Let me do these.
In the Middle East.
Yes, absolutely. So this was going on, Dr. Bob. And so you have, the reason I mention that is because that whole Israel as a settler colonialist, all that was the propaganda coming out of the KGB, working with some of the Arab states as well. And it persists. The one thing about propaganda, what makes it powerful is you keep saying the same thing over and over and over and over again, right? So these kids on the college campuses, they're hearing it over and over and over again, which is, again, how one of the ways I talk about, too, the black community in that sense got reluctantly pulled into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was because of Israel being called a racist state, a Jim Crow state, an apartheid state, right?
We can hate them like we hate the racist Ku Klux Klan.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So you have black people who are not only pro-Israel and philo-Semitic. They've been working with the Jewish people, but they also know these are lies. So Dr. King, of course, he famously defends Israel. His family and friends, Bayard Rustin, his own wife, Coretta Scott King, his dad, they joined an organization in the 1970s called Basic Black Americans to Support Israel Committee. We're actually working on a video of that right now. We're putting that out. And this is information, again, buried in history, right? But this is what's actually going on in the fight in the 60s and the 70s, Dr. Bob, is the fight now. I tell people the difference now is that, unfortunately, those lies are institutional. They're in the universities. They're unfortunately in some members of Congress, right? They're tweeting out all these things. The Ilhan Omar.
Members of Congress.
Yes, Dr. Bob, this was unheard of in the 60s and 70s, right? You heard that rhetoric, but it was in the fringes, right? It was out there.
Yeah, now it's in
But
Congress.
now it's professors and heads of departments and everything. They're saying these things, and they feel like they know because they've been told these things. They read this, they read that. They understand the lies that it's based on, right? So the desire and even the academic approach to try to dispossess the Jewish people of the land of the Jewish people, right? It's crazy, but that's where we are now. And because of its persistence, it's why it has become, as you know, one of the whole. You flash your justice bona fides by being anti-Israel, right? If you're not a true person of justice unless you're against the Zionist state of Israel, nothing could be further from the truth. But that's the level of disinformation. That's what we're fighting against right now.
And the Palestinians, who were refugees, primarily left of their own volition.
Yes, sir.
Tell that story.
That's part of what we talk about in the whole Mizrahi thing, and I did that. I was able and honored to do the PragerU University video in 2016.
Wonderful video.
They do amazing work, as you know. You stand there and you read. You know, I did the script, and we kind of worked on it together. But they do all the other stuff, and it's amazing. They do amazing work. I love what they do. Yes, so about 700,000 Palestinians or Arab Palestinians fled because their
during
leaders,
the war. This is the war of liberation.
Yes,
when,
sir.
when
Absolutely.
Israel was attacked.
Yes, sir.
The day that Israel was announced to be a state,
Yes, sir.
was attacked by, I forget, 5 or 6
Yes.
separate countries around
Yes,
Israel.
absolutely. May 14th, 1948 is Israel's Independence Day. And the 15th, the very next day, about 5 different Arab nations
Attacked.
also funded by the Soviet Union, attack Israel, right? It's by the miracle of God, the Jewish people staved it off, right? That war in the 56 with the Suez War, the 67
The
war.
first war,
That first war.
the leaders
Yes.
of the people who were living there at the
Yes.
time, the Arabs and the
Yes.
Muslims who were living, told them to leave.
Told them to leave, right?
And it's going to be a war.
Yes.
You leave and you come back, and it'll be those houses will be yours.
You guys clear out of the way. We're going to destroy this Jewish state, no problem.
And you'll
And then
come
you guys
back.
can move. And that's exactly what happened, Dr. Bob. And they did it. They were not able to destroy the Jewish state, good, thank God. And then it's a double a slap in the face to the Arab Palestinians. First of all, their leaders told them to leave, and they couldn't make good on that promise. They couldn't destroy the Jewish state again. And then they wouldn't give them refuge in their country.
Wouldn't take care of them.
The
That's
Syrians,
correct.
the Egyptians, they don't
That's
have anything to do
correct.
with them.
They're not allowed into all of those Arab countries.
Treated worse than second-class citizens, right? So they made them refugees in that way.
Perpetual
And
refugees.
now here you are, 70-something years later, and they are still using them for that reason. That's it. We tell people all the time, if you're really concerned about Palestinian human rights, you'll start at the very beginning, how they were manipulated in that way, and how to this day, billions of dollars in international aid money is supposed to be going to help them, and Hamas and Fatah.
Every year.
And every year,
Every
Dr.
year.
Bob. Yes,
Right.
sir. Yes, sir.
Well, if you're interested in learning more about refugees, both the Palestinian and the Jewish refugees, you really have to watch this video on PragerU University by Dumisani Washington, and it's entitled, "Why Are There Still Palestinian Refugees?" And it's also on YouTube, by the way.
Yes, sir.
Speaking about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel groups, various surveys have found, they find the same thing, that African Americans today harbor anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli sentiments at a higher rate than the general population. I find that strange, considering the Jews were at the forefront of the civil rights movement in America in the 60s. And Martin Luther King Jr., as you mentioned, said the Jews have been more sympathetic and have been a better ally to African Americans than any other ethnic group. So given all that, why do you think that blacks in America are more anti-Semitic in general than the general population? Why? It doesn't make sense to me.
It's antithetical, Dr. Bob, but again, I talk about it in my book and I talk about it in my lectures as well, because it's a confluence of different things. What you have, particularly when you get to the 60s, right? And then once again, everything kind of pivots there, right? Dr. King was asked this very question, right? It's called the Rabbinical Assembly. He was the keynote speaker at the that time, the 68th Annual Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism, the guest of Rabbi Heschel and the other rabbis that were there. And eerily, I write about in my book, it was 10 days before he was killed, 10 days before he's assassinated. One of his last public addresses is with a room full of rabbis, right? He's at a rabbinical conference. And one of the things that they're talking about, Dr. Bob, is Israel, the Israeli-Arab conflict, anti-Semitism in the black community, this very thing that we're talking about right now, because it was strange, right? The rabbis are saying, Dr. King, can you help us make sense of this? We're hearing anti-Semitism coming from the younger Black Panthers, but it was strange to them because they knew obviously what anti-Semitism was. They knew what Jew hatred was. It wasn't new, but they had never heard it coming out of the black community. That's why it was so strange. It was a remarkable question because they're saying, okay, we've never heard this from black people, right? What's going on, Dr. King? Right. So he begins to break it down, and it's a longer answer. He talks about what's going on in the cities versus what's going on in the country, that all the kind of thing. But he begins to talk about, Dr. Bob, how some of it is being stirred up. He talks about this whole, one statement he makes, he says there's on top of the Arab-Israeli conflict, he said there's a kind of mystique in being colored. In other words, there's some who believe that anything that's not colored is bad. In other words, this whole black is good, white is bad, that whole Marxist thing, this was already happening in the 60s. Yes. Right. So Dr. King was beginning to explain to them, some have this mindset. He said, he said, the vast majority of the civil rights community does not hold to that. We don't believe white bad, black good. We deal with people. That's why the whole content of their character, right? Dr. King.
I love that statement.
So he's explaining this to them and he's talking about it. And so what we find, Dr. Bob, is that once again, going back to the whole Yasser Arafat and the whole disinformation, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and all these things are happening at the same time. While the Arab states are unable to remove the Jewish state, and they're seeing time after time they're losing these battles, right? Israel's fighting these wars, paying a high price, but the Jewish state stands, right? They turn their attention more and more to disinformation and propaganda. And what their weapon of choice was more than any other time was to manipulate a true struggle for justice. That's why Israel's an apartheid state, Israel's a Jim Crow state. They would say these things, and it was for black people of conscience like Bayard Rustin, like A. Philip Randolph, Dr. King's friends who start this pro-Israel organization. They do it for two basic reasons. Number one, they knew Israel was being lied on. The Jewish people were being lied on, right? Mm-hmm. But they also knew that it was a very dangerous thing when you start calling a democratic state like Israel an apartheid state or a Jim Crow state. Not only is that a lie, but you're not paying attention to what's going on in other parts of the world, right? So the United Nations, in the Arab states, where there's slavery, there's still to this day.
Slavery today.
Millions of slaves in Libya and Mauritania and Saudi Arabia. So this is actually going on. So as you're doing that, you're also, not only are you lying on the Jewish people, not only are you coming against the Jewish state, which is going to stand, it's going to be strong, but it's these other nations that are suffering, they're not being paid attention to. Dr. King begins to explain this in terms of some of what the rabbis are seeing, right? The Angela Davises, the Eldridge Cleavers, right? These are the younger ones of this more radical civil rights movement. Yes. Right. And what's happened is that because of that, there's a scripture in the Christian side of the Bible said they have this great zeal, right? So they're just frothing at the mouth. And so what's happening for them, unfortunately, is they're being manipulated. Oh, yeah, you hate the racists and these white people. This is what those Jews are doing to us. These Jews came and they stole our land. And so that becomes part of the talking points with some. Quick, interesting story. Eldridge Cleaver, who was at that time the Minister of Information for the Black Panthers, became a Zionist. I wrote about this in my book. Dr. Bob, short version of that story. I know we're talking here. He gets caught up in a police situation in which he's been accused of having shot a cop I believe in Oakland at the time. He flees from justice and goes to Cuba. And he gets there, Fidel Castro, and they treat him worse than the CIA. He recognizes that all this, stuff about it, he's like going, okay. So it's a police state the whole time. They're always tapping his phone, the whole thing like that. So he heads to Algeria, because he's already been told that the Arabs are his friends, right? Right, sure. And especially the Arabs who are anti-Israel, right? Right. So he goes there, and now he sees slavery. The slavery you and I are talking about right now.
In Algeria.
Right, in Algeria. He lives this way for 7 years. There's even a famous picture of him and Yasser Arafat holding hands, right? Because they have this big Palestinian rally in Algiers, right? But he lives there, Dr. Bob, and he sees that he's been sold a bill of goods.
I never heard that story.
Dr. Bob, it is an amazing thing.
It's in your book?
It's in my book. I write about my book. I give the links to it and everything and stuff. And we're going to do some of our videos that are coming out, our content videos. Excellent. Because of your generous gifts, Dr. Bob, we're going to be one by one putting these videos out because people need to know these stories, right? And Dr. Bob, he actually comes back to the United States, surrenders himself to the authorities, becomes a Zionist. He begins to do the research. Not only does he know he's been lied to, he says, not only are the Jewish people not doing what they're accusing him of, they have done more to fight against racism and oppression than any other people. He talks about whether they're anthropologists, whatever, he talks about generations of Jews who worked and labored to lay aside all of this is bad, these genes are good, these genes are bad type of thing. That he recognizes that not just the Jewish state, which is a beacon of democracy, but the Jewish people. So this Eldridge Cleaver,
I had never heard of this story.
A Zionist, he defends Israel.
Is he alive now?
He passed away in the 1980s, Dr. Bob and everything. But yeah, so he tries to talk to the Angela Davises, these people who are his friends, right? These are all his comrades, right? Yeah. He comes back, he goes, guys, we got it all wrong, right? That whole 7-year saga for him, he returns and recognizes that Israel needs to be defended. The Jews are our friends. We're being lied to. they're trying to destroy America. He becomes very pro-American. The whole thing, Dr. Bob, he gets a baptism by fire, if you will, right? He reckons when he comes back, Dr. Bob, he becomes part of those black voices standing up and defending Israel because of the experiences. He went through all the radical thing that he went through. He came back, and he became still this person who wanted justice, but he began to understand, true justice, not this whole bill of goods were being sold, Dr. Bob. So
I never heard that story. That's a great story of redemption. I'm sorry he wasn't more successful.
Yeah. He tried his best, Dr. Bob. He recognized it. He even said that he was in. If people want to do, they can Google an article. Reason magazine did a piece on him a few years before he passed away and everything like that, kind of reflecting on his career and everything like that. He talked about how he did his best to try to turn. He saw how he gotten pulled away, and he tried to want to get
redeem
back.
Himself.
He tried to do it. Yes, sir.
And considerable interest these days to Jews in America is the organization Black Lives Matter, or BLM. It frequently spews anti-Israeli hatred, although you would wonder, I mean, they should be focused on the lives of blacks in the community, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Why do you think BLM is so focused against Jews rather than on the real problems that the blacks in the inner city are facing?
So I just happened to finish an article, IBSI, our organization, Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. We have a regular publication that we do called Africa Israel Weekly. And I just finished a piece a few days ago called What the Pro-Israel Community Gets Wrong About Black Lives Matter. And it's not an attack on the pro, but it's an analysis, and we talk about this.
No, leftist Jews don't get it. They like the term Black Lives Matter. Oh, yeah, we're all for that. And they think that's what the organization is.
Yes, sir. It's another play on words, which is another almost like a psyop, right? Because as I say in the article, for most people, black, white, whatever, if you say Black Lives Matter, it means to them, black people are worth as much as everybody else, right? Everybody should be treated the same way. And everybody's going to agree with that, right? Okay, black lives shouldn't be worth less than anybody else's, right? But unfortunately, that's not what the organization is about, right? And so it started in 2013, Black Lives Matter did. By 2014, it had already become pretty anti-Israel, meaning it was already doing anti-Israel activity. The whole Mike Brown shooting in Ferguson, people remember that?
I remember that.
Black Lives Matter explodes on the scene at that point. Although they started the year before, people didn't really hear about them, right? But it was in 2014. I tell people all the time, most people heard about 2020 with the whole George Floyd.
Right. That's when most people thought that it started.
They had already they had already blown up, as you will, 2014, and were already anti-Israel at the time, right? So this was like, people say, oh, it wasn't recently. It was almost from the very beginning of the organization. And Dr. Bob, I say it in my article, not to be salacious, but just to be honest, I said, if you really want to understand the motive and the way Black Lives Matter does what it does, you can't compare it to a civil rights organization like the Urban League or the NAACP.
It is not a civil rights organization.
No, it is not. You have to compare it to the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization.
I see.
In terms of its mentality. Why? Right. Here you have a lot of, and I talk about it in my article, there are a lot of parallels that are there about how the same way the PLO uses Arab Palestinians for the purpose of demonizing Israel, they don't care about the Palestinian people. Black Lives Matter talks a good game, but the millions, tens of millions of dollars that have been raised, that even Black Lives Matter chapters are asking where the money is, right? Families with whom they raise that money, right? With the death of this person, death of that person, and even families. There's a whole network of moms who are being used and manipulated by Black Lives Matter. Say, okay, where's all this money, right? What are you doing? We come to find out later they're buying expensive houses. Yeah. Multiple ones, Canada, United States, right? They're living lavishly themselves, right? Doing nothing for the community. I have a pastor friend of ours who's part of our coalition in Chicago, doing amazing work there in South Chicago. He spoke out against Black Lives Matter. He got death threats because he dared to tell the truth. He was questioning all this money being raised and the destruction of our community.
Destruction?
Yes.
The riots?
Yes.
Who do they hurt most? The people in that community.
Dr. Bob.
Those stores are places where the community shops.
My mom, going back to my parents, you talked about, my mom is the one who taught me this principle when I was a little kid. I'm growing up in Northern California, and I still don't remember how she did it, but I think maybe it was pictures because there was no internet, right, in the 70s. And she's showing me pictures of some of the burnt out buildings in Watts. She said, Dumisani, these were destroyed in 65, 67, 68. And she says, these stores, many of them will never return. And she explained to me in grade school, here's the problem with the riots. She broke it down. And my mom, she wasn't college educated, but she knew it's the stuff like the back of her hand. She said, public schools get their funding from property taxes. And when the properties are destroyed, people leave, the revenues go down and affects the school. She said, this is another way that affects them. Talking about poor black communities. She said, once these stores and these businesses are destroyed, it not only affects the economy, right? It affects in terms of jobs, but it also affects the school. And the spiral of poverty continues. She says, when that happens, they're destroying their own livelihood, their own future. And I'm not a little kid, right? So she's talking me these very deep political things. So I didn't really get it as I got older and I saw the Rodney King riots in LA. Yeah. And then later on, the whole Mike Brown, I went, this is what Mama was talking about. I said, so I'm watching this thing. I'm going, okay, this is not, people, man. I was like going, okay, but how, if I get angry at you because you did something to me and then I burned down my house, what the hell does that do to you, right? How does that help me, right? It doesn't help me at all. I have to think and strategize. If there's some injustice that I have to address that in a smart way.
Well, it helps the communists, the socialists.
If you want to destroy everything,
you want to destroy things. You want people to be angry. You want them to be poor.
Yes.
You want them to depend on you.
Yes.
And that's what's happening in American cities today.
Enter Black Lives Matter. This is the point. We come in, let's get defund of the many talking points that they had, along with the hating of Israel, right? The fact that I tell people, what does Israel or the Israeli Palestinian
have to do with the black community,
right? Absolutely nothing, right? But against that same mentality from the 60s, when you talk about the Eldridge Cleaver, this is how we said you have to compare. If you compare BLM to PLO, it makes more sense. Okay, because you're not concerned about these people, just like the PLO is not concerned about Palestinians. You're concerned about raising money, destroying Israel, destroying America, right? So you'll use these black people, particularly these ones who maybe a death in the family, maybe there was a tragic situation with a cop, whatever the situation is. You've come in like a very, very corrupt person to use that person's pain to destroy their community, to destroy the nation, to try to destroy Israel.
Destroy their hope.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
And
defunding the police.
Yes, sir.
Which anybody with common sense knows that won't work in the inner city. They need, and I think recent surveys of people who live in the inner city say we want more police.
They did that study. So here you have George Floyd's killed in Minneapolis in May 2020. And right at that time, Black Lives Matter launches its campaign, Defund the Police. To this day, you go on the website, they have the hashtag Defund Police, right? And it becomes this talking point, like it's a very, very strong leftist talking point. Now you have politicians that are saying it like it's a thing, right? Yep. Right after that, Newsweek did a poll of 36,000 Americans of all ethnic groups and asked them about this issue. And they found that 61% of the African Americans polled not only did not want to have the police defunded, many of them wanted more police. When they did the whole score, 81% of Black Americans were not in favor of defunding the police or wanted more police. Yes, and we use that as an example. Here you have Black Lives Matter purporting to speak for the black community, and more than 80%
overwhelming majority
are saying you're not speaking for us.
Right.
Here,
overwhelming majority says we want the police or we want more police.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Bobby, you see this thread running throughout. That Black Lives Matter says da-da-da-da, and it builds itself. It has this strong name brand, right? It's getting people to kowtow to it, right? It's kind of, if you don't, that's how the whole
And the white leftists are buying into this.
Oh, Dr. Bob, we're saying, here's the thing. I talk about in the article, and I didn't say it this way, but now I can say it this way in the podcast. We talk about the fact that BLM, and we meaning the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, we were analyzing it from 2014, kind of just watching, charting, and researching and everything. And for what we can gather, it hasn't increased anti-Semitism in the black community. It hasn't, that, like you said, it's already higher levels. It didn't make it higher. What it did was bring in non-black people who thought they were doing a good thing by hashtagging and marching. Oftentimes, it's people, you can Google it. You type in Black Lives Matter rally, and you look at all those faces. Most of them are white. It's amazing.
Right. Like, most of them are white.
They're white because they're thinking, and maybe it's coming from a good place. We want to help. But it becomes this thing. So defund the police is going, okay, think about it for a moment. Do you want to live in an area that's high crime, has no cops? No, you wouldn't, right? This is why when you go home, you have safety, you have security, all those type of things. Everybody wants those things. They want their families safe and secure. Nobody wants to just live in a place where they're just being preyed on by criminals, by any type of bad things. We talked about that, and we're saying that The 81 is fun. I joked telling people when they did the survey about whether Black Americans were wanted. I said they could have asked me. I could have saved the money for the survey, right? Because could have told you who wants that, right? But it became the talking point. It became the trendy progressive talking point, right? So this whole defund the police. And Dr. Bob, as you know, the last couple of years, starting with 2020. Homicide and violent crime has been at
dramatic increase.
Oh, Dr. Bob.
Dramatic. And it's not COVID. You know,
no.
The politicians who are in favor of defunding to say it's not because it's COVID.
Oh,
it
Dr.
has
Bob.
nothing to do with COVID.
Absolutely
it has
nothing to do
with the leftist politicians, the leftist DAs,
Dr. Bob.
who are saying no cash bail.
Yes.
Right? No incarceration,
Right.
and
Yes, sir.
you can steal in California.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
$950 or less, and it's a misdemeanor.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir. Oh,
a
absolutely.
misdemeanor for which the police will not arrest you.
The former police chief of Chicago, he resigned a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. One of his laments was that they would arrest somebody with a gang affiliation with a gun. He'd be out by lunchtime, right? So they were saying, okay.
So demoralizing.
Right.
Risking your life to arrest these people.
Yes.
It's not a simple thing to arrest a gangster or a criminal or a gang member.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And why would you risk your life to bring them in and then the DA doesn't press charges?
Absolutely.
This is what's happening.
Ironically, San Francisco just recalled its DA.
Right.
Yes, sir. Just now for this very thing, right? Because all the crime and everything. And who, like you said, who pays the most for those crimes? Poor Black and Latino neighborhoods, these people, and the homicide rate, Dr. Bob, and I could start going on that these kids are 6, 7 years old, sometimes 3 years old. They're being shot in the crossfires. They're being killed. They're being gunned down in Philly. They're in L.A. and in Chicago and Baltimore.
But nobody cares because it's Black people doing the killing of Black people.
So they completely ignore it.
It doesn't matter.
And all Black Lives Matter, now that's concerned, has made it worse because the demonization of the law enforcement, the cutting back. Minneapolis, it finally did come close to. They were going to start cutting back in terms of the law enforcement and everything, and then the crime rose. And it's what's funny, in several different cities, they had to begin to put more budget dollars to bring the cops.
But you just told me something recent that happened about 911 calls. Tell me about that.
Yes. So you have one of the precincts in Michigan. I just read about this maybe a day or two ago. Yeah. Because of the high gas prices, they've already burned through their budget for fuel. So now when you call 911, and I don't remember exactly the precinct to look it up in Michigan, they say they'll talk to you. They'll have a conversation.
They're not going to send a car.
We're not coming. They're letting you know right off the bat. And of course, once that's publicated, once it's published there, of course, the criminals actually see that too, right? So if I'm thinking, I'm reading that criminal, you're going to go, okay, well, let's target that area. Why? Because when they dial 911,
nobody's going to come.
Nothing's going to happen, right? This is the aftermath. Obviously, that's an economic one. But what is already bad, Dr. Bob, as you know, across this country, is that but I talk about in my article, Black Lives Matter and the other very leftist organization, Jewish Voice for Peace. They came together and they launched a campaign called Deadly Exchange. That's the other part of the whole demonization of Israel. Blaming Israel for police brutality. Blaming Israel.
In America?
Yes. Yes. And people are like, what's going on? Because
some police departments do train with the Israelis.
Exactly. Right. So especially after 9/11, Israel, number one in counterterrorism.
Yep.
They train police officers around the world, right? Africa, Asia, you name it, right? They come there and they learn all these techniques to actually identify and help with counterterrorism. Helping their communities. Right. It has nothing to do with racial profiling, none of those things, right? So what these people have done, very, very evil and twisted, Black Lives Matter, Jewish Voice for Peace, they said that when something like happens, like a George Floyd, Mike Brown, it's Israel. And Dr. Bob, this is the campaign. And here's the thing, we'll talk about in the article. From what we've seen, it hasn't increased anti-Semitism in the Black community. What it's done is become a justice issue for other people who are not Black, right? Yeah. And that part of the demonization of Israel, right? Serious. So what you have, there's a study that came out in Tel Aviv study about 2 months ago that talked about how global anti-Semitism is rising more and more, and that the current things to combat it aren't working. They actually said, okay, something is happening. And what we surmise in an organization is a lot of this woke politics, a lot of this leftist progressive, that whole not really dealing with justice, but just painting people with a broad stroke. The critical ethnic studies curriculum in California that was made law for the CSUs 2 years ago, we know this, we're working with people, demonizes Israel, called Israel's an apartheid state. It encourages the kids to boycott Israel. How is that helping them in terms of education, right? It is indoctrination, right? And one of the ways it's connected to Black Lives Matter, they were one of the main ones campaigning for this curriculum.
Program, right.
That's what Black Lives Matter was doing, all that money and not helping the community. What they were doing quietly, behind the scenes.
Affecting education.
Yes, Dr. Bob. It was a programming that was going on. An indoctrination that was going on, and with many of the gifts and the donations going to Black Lives Matter, people not knowing that they're funding the hatred of Israel, the hatred of America. And then I tell people, sometimes I shoot from the hip, Dr. Bob, and said, okay, it's pretty idiotic for us then to complain about a rise of anti-Semitism, but we're feeding into some of the most anti-Semitic organizations that exist. We have to connect the dots, right? If these people are out on the streets demanding that Israel's apartheid state while they're supposed to be campaigning for justice, right? And they're actually helping curriculum that's actually demonizing Israel. Then we say, why is it rising? It's rising because we're feeding into it. We're not actually calling it out. So the curriculum, what's called the Critical Ethnic Studies curriculum, which is now law for the CSUs, is also throughout public school system in California, and it's spreading throughout the country. We get calls and emails all the time at the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel asking us about it, and we're telling them, well, that originated in California. And now they're doing it in different states, different public school systems.
And IBSI is out there fighting this, right? That's what you do. Absolutely. Day in and day out.
We educate people about what's going on, Dr. Bob, and we try to give them the tools that they need to actually combat it, which is why one of our our signature thing is called the Peace Initiative, Plan for Education, Advocacy, and Community Engagement, in which we are now working to recruit Black American and African young people from across the country, and they will go through our study program. They will travel to Africa and see the Africa-Israel synergy. They'll travel to the Holy Land, and they'll return and be the hub of Black Jewish synergy in their cities across the country. We educate, and we try to, in our best ability, the advocacy on the ground, what needs to happen on the ground. Those who are doing it in the halls of justice, more power to them. Our focus is really what's going on in the city, what's going on in Chicago, what's going on in LA, and that's what we're working to do, Dr. Bob.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with me today, and thank you so much more for the many years of your dedicated efforts standing up for Israel, fighting for anti-Semitism in the Black community and around the world. And you can help too. IBSI, the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, is a 501c3 organization and well worth supporting. I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe, and you'll be automatically notified of future episodes in this series.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.